We hope you enjoy the following video presentation sponsored by the C.S. Lewis Foundation. We are a nonprofit organization with a mission to equip and encourage Christians to live their faith within the world of ideas and arts. To help us continue to host events and make videos like this one, please make a donation after viewing the video by going to www.cslewis.org or clicking the link below. Thank you.
Malcolm is chaplain and fellow of Girton College here in Cambridge. He's has a very, very important Anglican church ministry, and he rides a Harley. What more can we say? Will you join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Malcolm Guite?
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. I know you're slightly panicking whether I'd arrived or not. I only just managed to fit in second breakfast. Well, that disqualifies me from talking about temperance then. So I want to, I've called this talk for you The Great Dance, Love and the Virtues from Dante to Lewis. I'm going to be talking about dance quite a lot. I only wish our glorious dancers were here. I think they've flown off to Switzerland, haven't they, the Ad Deum. I want, though, to begin this reflection on love and the virtues from Dante to Lewis by returning to the image with which we began in Ely in our service. I began our Cambridge part in the service in Ely. I chose for that service Psalm 1. And I want to return to that image of the virtuous man as being like a tree planted by the waters, bringing forth fruit in due season. Indeed, to the image of virtue itself as a tree rooted and grounded in love, that prime virtue. Love itself, therefore, rising in its virtue, using that word in the sense of both intrinsic quality, power, strength, virtus, as well as all goodness. Virtue of love arising, as it were, through the branches of the tree, sustaining and bearing the fruit of the particular virtues, courage, fortitude, temperance, justice, all, as it were, undergirded by, all at the service of, all bearing the seed of, and propagating the love which brought them into being and sustains them in the first place. I wanted to give you that image, and then lo and behold, when we were in St. John's last night, there it was on the programme, that beautiful tree of the virtues. For unless the virtues are rooted and grounded in love, unless they serve love, they may themselves, the virtues separated, isolated, they may themselves turn awry and wreak havoc. As Friar Lawrence says, you may remember, in Romeo and Juliet, nor aught so good, but strained from its fair use, revolts from true birth, stumbling on abuse. Virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied. And that, of course, is also what G.K. Chesterton observed in his great book, Orthodoxy, that what creates most havoc in the modern world is not sometimes an obvious vice for which someone could naturally feel guilty and about which they might repent, but a virtue taken in, as it were, away from all the others. This is how Chesterton puts it. He says, the modern world is not evil. He's writing in 1911, by the way. He's not seen some things that's still coming, but he says, the modern world is not evil. In some ways, the modern world is far too good. It is full of wild and wasted virtues, When a religious scheme is shattered, it is not merely the vices that are let loose. The vices are indeed let loose and they wander and do damage, but the virtues are let loose and the virtues wander more wildly and the virtues do more terrible damage. The modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. Thus, some scientists care for truth, and their truth is pitiless. And some humanitarians only care for pity, and their pity, I am sorry to say, is often untruthful. That's Chesterton writing right at the beginning of the last century. And of course, Lewis takes up that same theme in Mere Christianity, drawing it from Chesterton. And you can see it all over the place. You can see all those fair beginnings. You look back now at the terrible havoc wrought so destructively by the whole rise of communism. But if you go back, as people I know who've done the Great Books program will have done, and actually read Marx, you can see that the virtue of justice is being sought after. But it is a pitiless justice. It is a vision of equitable distribution in which man is only an economic animal, and in which a whole part of humanity is denied. But it was a virtue. It was a virtue separated from love, separated from prudence, separated from pity, doing extraordinary damage and havoc. So, all these virtues need, in some sense, in order to be good fruit, to spring from a good tree. A sound tree, says Jesus, cannot bear bad fruit, nor an evil tree good fruit. They need to be reconnected, to be rooted and grounded in love, but not just any old half-baked understanding of love. We need to give love his proper name, the one who utterly reveals for all time, opening his arms wide on the cross, what love is. They need to be rooted, finally, in the fullness of love and of the love of God, whose name is Jesus Christ, rooted and grafted again in Christ, the true vine. So, the image of a tree, rooted and grounded in love, bearing the virtues in branch and fruit, is helpful. But it is also, like all analogies, a little limited. The chief problem with the image of the virtues as a single rooted tree is that it is static. And the virtues, especially in their interplay with one another, in our moving world, the virtues, if they're to be at work, if they're to be flexible, if they're to be appropriate, if they're to actually help us in a given situation, need to be alert, alive, dynamic, in a kind of constant, mutually aware interplay with one another. They need to be up and moving. So what we really need to imagine, if we want to get the picture right, is the rooted, fruitful, steadfast virtues of the tree somehow set in motion by love. What we need to imagine, if we can, is trees dancing. Now wait a minute. There is a writer, I believe, who might have helped us to imagine what trees dancing might be like. Lucy looked very hard at the trees of that glade. Why? I do believe they're moving, she said to herself. They're walking about. She got up, her heart beating wildly, and walked towards them. There was certainly a noise in the glade, a noise such as trees make in a high wind, and though there was no wind tonight, yet it was not exactly an ordinary tree noise either. Lucy felt there was a tune in it, but she could not catch the tune any more than she'd been able to catch the words when the trees had so nearly talked to her the night before. But there was at least a lilt. She felt her own feet wanting to dance as she got nearer. And now there was no doubt that the trees were really moving in and out through one another, as if in a complicated country dance. And I suppose, thought Lucy, when trees dance, it must be a very, very country dance indeed. She was so, and of course you remember, they take her hand, she dances through the glade, and she realizes they're not dancing randomly. They're not simply shifting about aimlessly from foot to foot or root to root, as some of us do on dance floors. They're dancing in a beautiful circle around a still more glorious center, making that open glade where the moonlight falls. And she sees the lion and rushes towards him. So, Lewis, later on in that description, actually uses the phrase the great chain and the great dance. He refers to the dancing trees as part of a great dance. And of course, he was not the first to imagine that all the goodness and variety and virtues in every sense of the creation, to imagine them as moved and moving in a dance around about the center of love, a dance called, ordered, and moved by love himself. He was not the first to imagine that. I want to return at the end of this talk to Lewis, but I want to look back over Lewis's shoulder, as it were, at two other poets from whom he learned, as it were, the steps of the great dance to which he calls us. From whom he learned that the virtues must not only be rooted and grounded in love, but must also be set in motion and dance, have a kind of lilt, as Lucy said, dance to love's tune, that tune which George Herbert said, all things hear and fear. So, who did he learn that from? Well, it'll come as no surprise to you that the first person he really learned it from was Dante. But I also want to mention, though, Dante is very well known, and I'm glad that Diana's been doing a session on Dante and the virtues here. There's a second poet, an English poet this time, who also, I think, particularly helped Lewis and others to understand the notion of the cosmos itself as dance. The cosmos not only in its outward and visible, but in its inward and spiritual qualities, involved in a great dance. And that poet was Sir John Davies, an Elizabethan poet, a contemporary of Shakespeare's. So let's begin, though, with Dante and have a little look at love and the virtues in Dante together. Now, movement, dynamic, and indeed dance is at the very heart of the Commedia. In some ways, if you want to understand that poem, you must begin with its famous last line and look backwards from there to understand what's really going on. And of course, you know that last line is the love that moves the sun and the other stars. One shouldn't quote it in isolation, of course. What Dante is actually saying is, at that moment, at the end of that journey, having been led to the heart of things, at last, his will, his own inner will, is moving with the love that moves the sun and the other stars. He's discovered not only what one of the blessed said to him earlier, in his will is my peace, but actually in his will is my glorious and moving dance. It's not a stasis, it's a movement. So the love that moves the sun and the other stars, both outwardly and visibly and inwardly and spiritually, everything in Dante's cosmos is moved by love, except in that frozen place of static refusal, which is the core of hell. Everywhere else, love is the mover. It is love, the love that Beatrice had for Dante, as well as the love that Dante had for Beatrice, that got the whole adventure going in the first place. It is love from Beatrice that sends Virgil to Dante to rescue him in the middle of the dark wood at the beginning of the poem. And the whole of the Purgatorio is about the purging and perfecting of love. It's about clearing away, as it were, the clutter that has weighed down and disfigured and temporarily overburdened love so that love can stand up and stretch and be fully itself. Now, it's traditional to say that Dante treats the 7 deadly sins in hell and purgatory and the 7 virtues, that is to say, the 4 cardinal or classical Aristotelian virtues and the 3 theological virtues drawn from Paul, that he treats those 7 virtues in the Paradiso. But that is only really part of the picture. Because, as I say, the Purgatorio presupposes to have got there at all, however battered, however limping, however much impeded by all that's happened to us in our life. If we're there at all, we're there because love has rescued us, as it rescued Dante. Because love has come down and found us, even where our virtues have broken or stumbled or failed. That's what grace is. I'll just throw in a line of Milton here, because C.S. Lewis wouldn't like a talk to take place without a quotation from Milton. He has that wonderful thing about virtue and heaven, where he says, at the very end of Comus, having shown that we need the virtues for freedom, but he's suddenly, I think, anxious at the end of that poem that he might have set out a kind of Pelagian, you can pull yourself up to heaven by your own bootstraps kind of story, which would be very oppressive, actually. So he says at the end of that poem, remember, love virtue, she alone is free. And if virtue feeble were, heaven itself would stoop to her. Which, of course, is exactly what heaven did. So when we get into the Purgatorio, we're ascending this mountain to return to the garden whence we came and be made truly what we should be again. And yes, indeed, the 7 deadly sins are dealt with as we ascend. But it's just worth remarking on how that's done, because it tells you something about Dante's view of humanity, which is, I think, an essentially Christian view of humanity. And that is a view that although the image of God in us has been overcast and obscured and sometimes rendered certainly invisible and almost inaccessible to us by our fall, ultimately we are still his good creation. It is still there. And that redemption and salvation is about restoring what he gave in the first place, right at the depth of our nature. So what happens, if you've read it, you may remember, is that when they meet the angel at the gate at the beginning of purgatory, Dante is marked, as it were, artificially marked with a kind of scarring on his outside by the sword of this angel of judgment, with the letter P for peccatum, for sin, 7 times. I sometimes wish that Hawthorne of the Scarlet Letter might have had a chance to read this, because that whole protest against the way, kind of Christians might brand somebody with the letter and condemn them and all of that sort of thing. The whole point about knowing these letters, these sins, were, as it were, cut on the outside of you, is so that they can be removed, not so that they can stay there and label you forever, and so that you know that they are an outside thing ultimately. They needn't be an inward thing. You don't have to take those marks of the sins that you have done and have been done unto you, and make them an essential part of your soul. Lo, as far as the east is from the west, so far has he separated our sins from us. They can be on the outside. So Dante at first receives these 7 marks, and then he makes his way up the mountain in a series of extraordinary, if you like, dance-like circling movements. And of course, this is a great sort of parable of redemption that Dante gives us. The mountain of purgatory, the very mass of it, was thrown up on the other side of the world in Dante's imagination by the very matter that was, as it were, displaced when Satan fell from heaven and in his fall, as it were, made the conical pit of hell. So, purgatory, in his view, Mount Purgatory, is the positive shape that can be made out of the negative experience of hell. And whereas in hell you are descending through a series of what can only be called vicious circles, the very same going round and round, seeming to come back to the same place in your life again and again, even more stuck than before, which is the hell experience, till you're finally stuck at this frozen core. Those vicious circles in the purgatorio are suddenly transformed into virtuous spirals. You're still going round and round. You're still sometimes getting to the same place in your life, the same sense of, I've got to deal with my anger, I've got to deal with my pride, I've got to deal with my envy, have I ever got to deal with my lust? What am I, I keep coming back to this, but I've got a little bit further up the mountain each time. Something has happened, some development, some grace. And what happens in the Purgatorio is that he meets people dealing with each of these P's, these peccata, that have been, and it's amazing. The psychological truth of the images that he uses is just astonishing. So in pride, which is all apparently, pride on earth can feel like being boosted and bigged up and, loftily lifted above by others and all that sort of stuff. But when you see it for what it really is in Purgatorio, it's a bunch of people absolutely almost flat on their backs, weighed down, carrying an enormous and useless weight of heavy stone. Actually, the soul is being crushed by the pride that seemed to lift it up above measure. And actually, in some ways, if you look at so-called, successful people and the stars of stage and screen and the people who've been inflated up above measure, they are often actually crushed by their own image and incredibly anxious about maintaining a reputation that in fact they know they don't deserve in the first place. And the very maintenance of that high profile is itself a crushing weight. Dante shows you all of that. So you get round this and you finally throw the weight off, and guess what? An angel, a beautiful angel, dancing through the crowd, moving the other way with the feather's touch of a wing, light as a feather, brushes off that letter P, and it's gone from the soul. A little less burdened, you carry on up the mountain. The mountain leading towards that paradise actually is the reverse of all the other mountains. Most mountains, when you're climbing, it gets harder the higher you get. Here it gets easier. You're a little bit more yourself. You're carrying a little less weight. And gradually, the clear, beautiful human image, defiled by all those scars of sin, is clarified. And we see, as Blake called it, the human face divine. We're finally ready at the end of that to see face to face. We've got our faces back, in a sense. So that has already happened in Purgatorio. Love has been set free. And one of Dante's whole points is that these vices, the deadly sins, are not condemned because condemning them gives God pleasure or because he doesn't want people to have fun, but because each one of these things done in the way that we do them here damages who we are and damages other people and stops us from being the completely free, glorious and happy beings that God intends us to be. I love that question that Aslan asks. I think he asks it of Lucy in the last battle. And he says, "You do not yet look quite so happy as I intend you to be." And I feel that's what God is asking us constantly, when he's asking us, as it were, to set the virtues free and dancing, and as it were, remove the clutter. So the Purgatorio, as the name of the book itself suggests, is about removing the clutter and detritus and the unnecessary accretions of stuff. It's about getting things clear and ready to go. C.S. Lewis, speculating on that and realizing that there's a difficulty talking about this because, of course, the idea of purgatory was so grossly abused in an exploitative commercial way by the church in late medieval times. Quite understandably, the reformers were against it. But there was a danger that they missed out on something about the way God really does help us to prepare for heaven, because they wanted to... Lewis used a rather amazing analogy for it once. He said, about purgatory, he said, when the tooth of life is drawn, I'd like to hear the angelic, as it were, dentist's assistant say, now rinse your mouth out with that, so that I'm clear and ready to sing. So, all that's done, and we get to the place where, properly speaking, Dante does treat of the virtues. And that is indeed in the Paradiso. And he and Beatrice, as they rise through the seven heavens, with which, if we weren't familiar before, Michael Ward's Planet Narnia has made us so familiar now. He rises through the seven heavens and then up to the eighth sphere of the Stellatum. They do indeed rise through the virtues. Each of the virtues, the classical virtues in Dante, is given its own proper sphere. In fact, they go through them twice as they're rising. But so fortitude, justice, temperance, prudence, each in its own sphere, each in sense a world moved, of course, by the sphere above it and moving the sphere below it. You know that old view, that beautiful, as Lewis called it, discarded image, which had the idea of, at the very outer edge, love, God himself, moving an outer sphere. And that itself moved because it loves love, and because God loves it. And that motion, setting, as it were, in motion another sphere and another, each turning because it wants and loves the one above it, each turning because it's been given power by the one above it, each in the turn giving power to the one below it, all of them revolving beautifully, and the stars and planets in each of them, as it were, moving round and interconnecting in different ways. That's the picture. And Dante sees the virtues not only in here, but out there, and he imagines them. So, of course, he has the virtue of courage in the sphere of Mars. And that's how he sees it. And eventually, when you get up to the final sphere of the fixed stars, having looked at prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, he, as a Christian, is given a little kind of catechism in the three great theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And that is done, respectively, by Peter, James, and John. Can you imagine having John the evangelist come up to you and say, now what exactly is your understanding of Christian love? Remember, I'm the guy that said God is love, those who live in love live in God. Let's hear what you feel about that. I know it's quite difficult when you have a Viva exam, as we call it here, when you meet especially, and this does happen all the time in Cambridge, you have your Viva, after you've written your paper, and the person you're standing in front of wrote the book. Actually, talking about Vivas, I had an amazing story. I just heard this 2 or 3 weeks ago. I did a service, a memorial service for someone with the great English poet Geoffrey Hill. And he told me an amazing story after the service. I don't know how we got onto the subject, about when he was a young undergraduate in Oxford, and how he had a Viva on his undergraduate work, and he had to go in and defend an idea or deal with a new idea and debate it. And he walked into the room as a young man in Oxford, not knowing who would be there to quiz him on what he knew and understood about poetry and the way language works to kindle the imagination. And he walked through the door, and on the other side of the desk were J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson. Anyway, they thought he was all right. He passed. In fact, he said as he was going out, I haven't got time to tell you all the wonderful things they said. It was all about Keats. But he said he overheard Tolkien saying to Dyson as he was leaving the room, "I like the cut of that young man's jib." So Dante finally makes it up through all the various grades of the virtues, finally has his Viva examination on faith, hope, and love. And who does he get for love? He gets John the Evangelist. I say imagine what that's like, but actually you don't have to imagine what that's like. You only have to open your Bible remember that the book you read reads you. Read again about love in the Gospel according to St. John and in his letters, and you will find you are taking a viva, that he is reaching into you and calling out of you things you didn't know you knew about love, and putting into you things you need to know about love. So that's how it works in Dante. You get, as you go up through the spheres, in order, the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues. And in that, of course, Dante is following Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas has a scheme which, in a sense, has grace perfecting nature. Cicero and Aristotle had obviously known about these 4 cardinal or hinge virtues, but didn't have that vision of faith, hope, and love, these 3, and the greatest of these is love. So for Thomas Aquinas, that became a sense in which this was the gift of grace, this was the gift of revelation, this was the gift that Christianity gave to the classical world, to add to those 4 classical virtues, these 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. But that idea, that schema of Thomas's, taken alone, might actually give a false impression, a very false and damaging impression. It might give the impression that these lower virtues, these classical or humanistic virtues, could get along perfectly well without love. That faith, hope, and love are, as it were, just the icing on the cake, the upper branches of the tree. Not so. For you remember in Dante the great moment of renewal, the utter shift and change and reversal of perspective that happens at the very end of the Paradiso. He thinks he has climbed out and away from the center in the earth, up, further out towards the Imperium, to the final outer edge and topmost part of the cosmos. He thinks that's how he's journeying to God. But when he gets there, when he has the beatific vision, when he finally, so purged and renewed and cleansed, turns to the eternal fountain and looks, suddenly he realizes that he's been coming from a far outer rim, in all the time, towards a center, a still center, a glorious source and center of love at the heart of all things, and that the whole cosmos is unfolding like a rose around it. And all the joyous saints of God are like the petals. He thought he was going to the outer edge of the cosmos. He's coming instead to the center and the heart of the rose of love. And that love is at the heart of all things. It's not a special add-on extra. It's not the icing on the cake. It's the tiny seed from which all things spring. And then, of course, after that comes the amazing image of the scattered leaves. You remember, all bound together. He says, I'm reading from Dorothy Sayers' translation here. Dorothy Sayers, in this translation, by the way, just beautifully borrows a little bit of Bunyan. I think she figures if Dante and Virgil can have a conversation separated by 1,000 years or so, there's no reason why Dante shouldn't also quote John Bunyan. So this is how she translates this great moment in the Paradiso. O grace abounding, whereby I presumed so deep the eternal light to search and sound, that my whole vision was therein consumed. In that abyss, I saw how love held bound into one volume all the leaves whose flight is scattered through the universe around. Now that image of all the scattered leaves across the universe bound together in love may have been the inspiration somewhere filtered down through some quotation of the amazing song, Beatles song, Across the Universe. You might, thoughts are flying out like endless winds into a letterbox. It's a moving song, but actually that song is entirely the wrong way around. That song is all about scattering stuff across the universe. The gospel is about finding depth and beauty and purpose and coherence in everything that's been scattered across the universe and calling it back to be bound in the single volume whose meaning and substance is love. That binding together, and that's what religion means. Religio, it means tying back together again stuff that's been torn apart and separated. So, a wonderful passage, and I think that should give us pause if we're trying to think of a too hierarchical, too static, too fixed idea of the virtues. Dante suddenly, as it were, like a kind of wheeling around in a dance, like the top couple in a country dance suddenly being the bottom couple again and letting everybody else through their arch. He suddenly shows us that the love that you thought was the final pinnacle is also the first beginning. So in Dante, the virtues, turning in their spheres, moving one another, must all in the end be moved by love as they tread the great dance in the seven heavens. Now in Sir John Davies, a later writer, a contemporary of Shakespeare, who is also much read and loved by Lewis, he has the idea that the whole of the original creation was itself called into being by love in order to begin a dance. And he describes the dance both outwardly and visibly in the heavens, and inwardly and spiritually, and more interestingly still, ethically and interactively in the relations of people. He uses the idea of dance throughout, and it's all in a great poem called Orchestra, or a poem of dancing, which was a wonderful, fun sort of jeu d'esprit that he wrote as a young man, having come over from Wales to London. He wrote it in the same summer that Shakespeare was writing A Midsummer Night's Dream. If Doctor Who ever had a night off and was willing to lend me the TARDIS, I can tell you that a mysterious police call box would appear in the Mermaid Tavern in the mid-1590s, so I could buy these men a drink. But hasn't happened yet. So the idea behind the poem Orchestra is really quite straightforward and beautiful. He sets the scene in the story from the Odyssey of the return of Odysseus, return of Ulysses back to where Penelope is waiting. And you remember, while Penelope was waiting for Ulysses to come back, all these different suitors came and tried to woo her. And she was holding out because she knew eventually her husband would return. So that he sets his poem in that scene, and the poem is spoken by one of the suitors trying to persuade Penelope to dance. And Penelope says, I think dancing is a really newfangled idea, and I don't want to do one of these new trendy modern things. I only do ancient things. So the suitor then does this beautiful speech in which he tells Penelope that dancing is the most ancient thing of all and that the whole creation dances. I just want to read you some verses from this, partly for sheer fun and to give you a taste of it. But if we want to think about the virtues dancing, I think Davies can help us here. So Penelope's just said, I don't want to dance, that's a bit newfangled. And Antinous, who's the guy that's trying to woo her, replies, "Dancing, bright lady, then began to be when the first seeds whereof the world did spring, the fire, air, earth, and water, did agree by love's persuasion, nature's mighty king, to leave their first disordered combating, and in a dance such measure to observe, as all the world their motion should preserve. Since when they still are carried in around, and changing one in another's place, yet do they neither mingle nor confound, but every one doth keep his bounded space, wherein the dance doth bid it turn or trace. This wondrous miracle doth love devise, for dancing is love's proper exercise. Isn't that a lovely idea? And it's this is an ancient idea that the four elements, the earth, air, water, and fire, would destroy one another if they weren't set into a certain order. And so, even as he asks the lady to dance, it's all right, I don't need it. Even as he asks the lady to dance, he's telling her that the cosmos itself is in a dance. Now, we don't, of course, have the same theory of the four elements. And this theory of the four elements was indeed being challenged in Davies' day. And people were rereading Democritus and Lucretius and coming up with what we would now think of as atomic theory, atomism, the idea of small, tiny, undivided particles, the smallest and most indivisible thing that were kind of bouncing about and bouncing off one another and creating in that interaction the phenomena that we call the cosmos. That's not a really recent idea. It's cropped up every so often. And even the idea that this is all totally random has cropped up every so often. Previous ages that seriously thought about it weren't stupid enough to sustain it for as long as we have. But, it has been thought. And in fact, in this poem, Davies actually mentions it. And this is what he says. He uses the word motes here. In another of his poem, he calls the little tiny particles, rather nicely, he calls them the swarming atomies. But anyway, he calls them motes here, little motes. So, or if this all, which all around we see, as idle Morpheus, some sick brains have taught, of undivided motes compacted be, how was this goodly architecture wrought? Or by what means were they together brought? They err which say they did concur by chance. Love made them meet in a well-ordered dance. Isn't that wonderful? And they err that say they did concur by chance. Love made them meet in a well-ordered dance. So having talked about dance as a way of thinking about the constant motion, never seemingly random at times, but always producing distinct and beautiful order, having said that the nearest thing we've got to understand what that's like is dance. Having said that, he then turns to the way we live with one another and the problem of what could be combating or warring elements in ourselves and in our society, and tries to think about how dance might be a helpful metaphor for us there. And he particularly talks about the idea of what he calls concord. Concord being the way different things can be brought into a concord, into a right relationship with each other. And this is what Davies says. The richest jewel in all the heavenly treasure that ever yet unto the earth was shown is perfect concord, the only perfect pleasure that wretched earth-born men have ever known. For many hearts it doth compound in one, that when so one doth will, or speak, or do, with one consent, consent's the important word, with one consent they all agree thereto. Concord's true picture shineth in this art, i.e. in the art of dancing. Concord's true picture shineth in this art, where divers men and women ranked be, and every one doth dance a several part, yet all in one in measure do agree. Do you see that? The thing there he's saying, of course we're throwing different shapes, but we are actually dancing to the same tune, if we'll listen. And even in the freedom of our particular movements, if we will let love so order them, the pattern of a dance will emerge. Observing perfect uniformity, all turn together, all together trace, and all together honor and embrace. And then he goes on in the next verse to coin, I think, a really beautiful phrase, which I think should have become a proverbial term in English. He talks about how people should do as they dance. And particularly how couples dancing these lovely country dances together could learn a little bit from the moves in the dance about how to be married happily together. Could do as they dance. I think do as you dance should be just a common phrase. I think it'd be a great phrase. So, this is what he says. If they whom sacred love hath linked in one do as they dance in all their course of life, Never shall burning grief, nor bitter moan, nor factious difference, nor unkind strife arise betwixt the husband and the wife. For whether forth or back or round, this is a nice one, you can see the dance itself almost. For whether forth or back or round he go, as the one doth, so must the other do. As the man doth, so must the woman do. It's wonderful, wonderful image of dancing. And then he concludes the sort of ethical part, the virtues part of that poem with these words. Much more, in dancing's art, in dancing's grace, blindness itself may reason's footsteps trace. For of love's maze it is the curious plot, and of man's fellowship the true love knot. Isn't that extraordinary? He's not only asking for us to, he's actually saying, let's do some science around this. In the movement, if we keep looking at the dance of all things in the cosmos, we can trace the footsteps of reason. We can see that the Logos has been here. There's an extraordinary series of hints about how we might think about the world, all in this light-hearted poem written by a young man of 25 in the golden summer of 1594. Quite extraordinary. So, what might it mean for us to imagine the virtues dancing? Why might we want to do that? Well, I suppose you could put it like this. Think of the virtue of courage. Sometimes it's really important that courage should be to the fore. But sometimes courage can almost get overheated and get carried away. And it may be that occasionally courage needs to reach out and take Prudence's hand. And Prudence might give Prudence a little whirl. And Prudence might actually get courage, occasionally prevent her boyfriend Courage from stepping on quite so many people's toes. But equally, Prudence is a shy girl. And maybe sometimes Courage has to sweep her off her feet a little bit. But maybe when he lifts her up, she can look out and help Courage see where he's going. Somewhere else in the same dance, Justice is there. A bit big, a bit foursquare, setting his feet down. Vital, important. You've got to have justice in the dance of the virtues. But maybe, just occasionally, justice needs to join hands with love and mercy, and they can teach him a lighter step. The virtues need to dance with one another. So, I said I would return to Lewis, and that's what I'd like to do. It seems to me that the place where he most explicitly draws on what he's learned from both Dante and Sir John Davies on the moving dance that constitutes the grace of God, not the grace of God static, but the grace of God in motion, is in that glorious and most poetic of all his prose works, Perelandra, A Voyage to Venus, a book which actually could probably have been titled Paradise Not Lost, with apologies to Milton. That's another thing I'd like to, talking about going to the Mermaid Tavern. Another conversation I'd like to overhear would be the one between C.S. Lewis and Milton when they met in Aslan's country. I think Lewis might blush slightly and Milton might say, remember my book Paradise Lost? So where's my credit in Perelandra? But anyway, unfortunately, not even the TARDIS will get me to Aslan's country. For that I need the blood of Christ. But thanks be to God, I have it. So, do you remember the end of Paradise Not Lost? The glorious moment when the Lord and the Lady are brought together again. And all the great planetary spheres, the intelligence, the Eldila, the angels, all the creatures themselves are gathered together. And there's this amazing it's kind of like an oratorio. These different voices start singing. And the prose takes off into the most golden poetic prose. In fact, when the poet Ruth Pitter read this, she was absolutely ecstatic, and she wrote to Lewis and said, please, please, I want to make a poem out of this. I think it would just go so well in Spenserian stanzas. And Lewis wrote back and said, well, sure. And then a couple of weeks later, she wrote and said, Jack, I didn't have to change anything. I just made sure, I hardly had to change a word to turn this into, and it was true. You can see the poem that she made of it. It's amazing, So he was, anyway. Here is what Lewis says in the end of Perilandra about the great dance, and I think it's the dance not only of all the things in the cosmos outwardly, but it is also the dance of grace and the dance of the virtues. The great dance does not wait to be perfect until the peoples of the low worlds are gathered into it. We speak not of when it will begin. It has begun before always. There was no time when we did not rejoice before his face as now. The dance which we dance is at the center, and for the dance all things were made. Blessed be he. Another voice said, never did he make two things the same. Never did he utter one word twice. After earths, not better earths, but beasts. After beasts, not better beasts, but spirit. After a falling, not recovery, but a new creation. Out of the new creation, not a third, but the mode of change itself is changed forever. Blessed be he. And another said, here's that image from the beginning, it is loaded with justice. As a tree bows down with fruit, all is righteousness, and there is no equality. Not as when stones lie side by side, but as when stones support and are supported in an arch. Such is his order, rule and obedience, begetting and bearing, heat glancing down, life growing up. Blessed be he. One said, they who had years to years in lumpish aggregation, or miles to miles and galaxies to galaxies, shall not come near his greatness. The day of the fields of Abel will fade, and the days of deep heaven itself are numbered. Not thus is he great. He dwells, all of him dwells, within the seed of the smallest flower, and is not cramped. Deep heaven is inside him, who is inside the seed, and does not distend himself. Blessed be he. Each grain is at the center. The dust is at the center. The worlds are at the center. The beasts are at the center. The ancient people are there. The race that sinned is there. Tor and Tinindral are there. The gods are there also. Blessed be he. Where Mal-Eldil, who's the Christ figure of this world, where Mal-Eldil is, there is the center. He is in every place, not some of him in one place and some in another, but in each place, the whole Mal-Eldil, even in the smallest beyond thought. There is no way out of the center, save into the bent will which casts itself into the nowhere. Blessed be him. Each thing was made for him. He is the center. Because we are with him, each of us is at the center. He died in the wounded world. He died not for me, but just for me, but for each man. And if each man had been the only man made, he would have done no less. Each thing, from the single grain of dust to the strongest Eldil, is the end and final cause of all creation, and the mirror in which the beam of his brightness comes to rest, and so returns to him. Blessed be he in the great dance. Isn't that a wonderful passage? So, simply to conclude, let us not just, as we have been doing throughout this conference, and so vitally, let us not only reclaim the virtues for human flourishing in the 21st century, let's set them dancing again. Thank you.